Here we are.
Here we are. Welcome to episode 5 of Everything She Knows. It's been a long and arduous journey just to making this recording, and I'm really sad that it's unfortunately not live because of some technical difficulties. But I think I will be making some upgrades to my computer after this. But now here we are. We're going to have a dope-ass discussion. Today I am here with Karla Monterroso and Y-Vonne Hutchinson, whose beautiful face you see on video. We are going to talk about, responsible tech, problematic tech. We're going to talk about all of the things. So last week, just to recap, last week I hosted Dr. Nan Johnson, who also happens to be my grandmother, and we had a conversation about business and education through the ages. Are we doing better? Are we doing worse? Is it just new flavors of the same ish? I don't know why I'm saying ish now, like I haven't already been cursing. And today we're going to have a conversation, like I said, about responsible tech. Is it our savior? Is it our doom? Is it both? And you can I guess you can't chime in with your questions and comments as we go, but you can follow us on Twitter and use the hashtag Everything She Knows, and we will happily respond to anything that you have and want to share about what we talked about today. Sound fair?
Sounds good.
Yeah? Okay,
Sounds
cool.
Good.
So today, like I mentioned, I have 2 incredible special guests with me. Karla, who's sitting right next to me, and Y-Vonne, who's here on video. These are 2 incredible women who I've had the privilege of co-creating with and banding with them on Build Tech We Trust, which we will definitely get into because it absolutely has to do with responsible tech. Karla, who's right here, Karla Monterroso, has been doing justice work in education, healthcare, and tech for the last 20 years, everywhere from the Bay to DC to Bluefield, West Virginia, to Charleston, South Carolina.
Yeah.
This girl has seen it. This girl has done it. She's currently the CEO of Code 2040 and also the board chair of the nonprofit 1 Degree, and she is the co-founder of Build Tech We Trust. Y-Vonne Hutchinson, who is joining us through video, is a former international human rights lawyer who's worked with the State Department, the United Nations, and foreign international governments. Her interests sit at the intersection of tech, labor economy, equity, and human rights. She is the CEO and founder of ReadySet, which is a diversity, equity, and inclusion firm that's focused on human-centric management practices. She's also the co-founder of Project Include, and she's the co-founder of Build Tech We Trust as well, and our resident lover of pie, I believe, as well.
Yes.
Yes.
Send the pie my way.
Send her all the pie.
All of it.
And so here we are. We are going to just dive right into it, right? So I think one of the things that I want to kind of start off by contextualizing for the folks who are listening and watching this is that, the 3 of us have known each other in some shape or form, and we've run a lot in the same circles. But there was a particular event that kind of brought us together in a way that we decided that we wanted to be more proactive about some of the things that we were seeing in terms of problems that were coming up with technology. And I mean, in a way, we all fight problems with technology or in the tech industry, both with Code 2040, with ReadySet, with Black and Brown Founders, with other things that we've started as well. But there was a really specific thing that brought us together. And I kind of want to let the 2 of you sort of tell the story and the experience, because it started with Y-Vonne and Karla having a conversation and then bringing me and 8 other people together to take action. So do you want to start, Karla, and then Y-Vonne, you jump in?
Sure.
I think Y-Vonne and I had gone to dinner one night, and we were sitting there talking about how for everyone that was in the diversity and tech space and movement, that we all still kind of felt like we were moving in our own boats, but not all in the same direction, and that we were starting to see a lot of just threats to our people happen, right? And we kind of talked about the need for broader coalition and all of that, and then once the El Paso shooting happened, Y-Vonne sent me a text message that was like, this is the moment. We have to do something. And and like I think I'll leave some of that of what happened next to Y-Vonne, but for me it was just such a, like, I think that moment had so much grief in it for me personally as a Latina, and the ability to channel that grief into really setting up the world that we wanted to see was really meaningful to me.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think just to build on what Karla said, you know, when El Paso happened, I don't think it was just El Paso, right? There was this 2 weekends, right, where there's this spate of shootings. There was Gilroy, there was El Paso, and I think there was a shooting in Ohio that week as well. And we saw that, you know, a lot of these shootings were racially motivated, particularly against Latino communities, but also just against communities of color at large. And you know, after the conversation I had with Karla, you know, I remember waiting in the spate of these shootings, knowing that there was a tech tie, right? Knowing that like these terrorists had broadcast their plans through, you know, 4chan, 8chan, and that like tech in a way was amplifying their voices and enabling them to coordinate. I found myself waiting for a tech response. I mean, this is like the most violent weekends, you know, in America. So many people died, and I think so many people felt so vulnerable. And I was shocked as we looked across our industry and we saw our leaders were silent. And I think for Karla and I, that was the real wake-up call. I think part of us wanted like somebody else to say something.
Yeah.
We don't want to wait into this. This is
for sure they're going to say something now.
Yeah, it's like they've got to say something. And then it was like just crickets.
Yeah.
And it was, you know, it was a moment for me where I was like, well, if they don't say something, we have to say something, because now it's our communities that are being targeted, and people are leveraging these platforms to perform domestic terrorism. And communities of color and vulnerable communities are a target. I mean, they targeted a freaking garlic festival. So, you know, it just felt like the time was just so imperative for us to come out and say something.
Yes. And so what came of that was us, the three of us plus 7 other really incredible leaders, everyone doing different things in the tech industry, writing an open letter that especially wanted to address the companies that are behind the platforms that make some of these tragedies possible through the radicalization, the extremism that we're seeing happening online, and really wanting to take a stand around deplatforming white supremacy. And that is where Build Tech We Trust started. So that said, I want to kind of kick off like a discussion here and ask the two of you if you think that tech is evil. And whether you do or not, what do you think we should be most concerned about when it comes to technology, especially from the different perspectives that you have with the work that you do?
Why don't you go first, Y-Vonne?
Okay. Yeah, so I subscribe to the belief, I don't think that technology is necessarily good or evil. I don't think it's also neutral either. There's a computer scientist who also did some international development work named Kentaro Toyama, and he has this theory called the theory of amplification, which is essentially technology amplifies whatever forces are already existing, whether they're human or systemic. And I think that's how I feel about technology. I think it has the potential to amplify the best of us, the worst of us, the most inconvenient about us, and it's kind of how we decide to leverage the technology that is the question, not whether the tech itself is good or evil, and what safeguards we're putting in place to make sure that technology doesn't do any harm, and how honest we are with ourselves around the inputs that go into the technology that we build.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think for me, the framework I'd used to think about it was an accelerant, right? So like it's like a snowball, and it runs with all of our human fallibility. It will accelerate all of the things that we are fallible at, right?
Yeah.
So like that is as much a like racism having different political opinions. I like, as we speak here on Super Tuesday,
Yes.
watch the internet melt down on itself as it tries to grapple with democracy in real time.
Like watching it was the first time I feel like, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no,
but
please go ahead.
it was the first time I feel like I'm like, I have to get off of this thing.
Yeah.
Because there's like way too much coming at me
Yeah.
right now, and it's ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it's an accelerator of all of our worst traits, right? It's like when as a human, like at least for me, when I'm having a bad day or struggling with something, the ability to pause and like slow down and be in my body and respond in my best self is such a key part of like the being a good human citizen process, right? And technology essentially takes out, when it's like algorithmically done, it takes out the ability to pause and really consider, right? Unless pre-programmed in.
Yeah.
And when it is, and its current design when it comes to the social space actually encourages a rapid fire, like reactive response, like all bypassing the all cerebral cortex, just react. And that means that all of the pieces that we bring of ourselves into different places, like a good chunk of those things get washed away because it is the react and response versus the like. I have a mentor who's like, just rest and digest, man.
Rest and digest. I like that.
And like, there is no room for rest and digest in the current build of technology. If anything, that is seen as an impediment to doing the things in the method, because in the first iteration of all of this, the largest like valued principle in the building of the internet has been speed, right? And like, and you see it actually not just in the designs of the socials and the ways that the algorithm does things, and because technology has the ability to accelerate, but even in the ways that people talk about interviewing for engineers, in the ways that people talk about solving problems culturally in the tech industry, like the largest value that they perpetuate is speed. Yeah. As if speed creates intention. Yeah. Right? And that's just not the case.
And I would also just add to that, but speed and scale. Yeah. Right? Like technology is all about like having us be more efficient, which I feel like ties into the speed question, but also to do things at scale. We're going to touch more people at the same time than we've ever touched before. And while we're doing that, to your point, we're going to just rapid fire say whatever's at the top of our brains. And, and there's an inherent good there, right? There's an inherent good with that expediency, and then that relationship, that the proximity that we have as well.
I feel like I also want to throw another log on that fire and add attention in there as well, because I feel like the other thing I would say that I hear a lot is around, how do we make things sticky? How do we keep eyeballs on this? How do we make sure that people are watching longer? All of that too. Yeah. So it definitely sounds like a brewing of a perfect storm. Yeah. So then I feel like what I'm hearing is that it's not that tech is evil, but that it will amplify or accelerate the part, like all of the whatever we put in it, right? Yeah. And that a lot of what gets put in it tends to be some of the not so great parts of ourselves.
Well, I would push back a little bit too, because I think that while like yes, there's a lot of not so great parts, and we have to focus on the not so great parts, because the impact they're having is incredibly severe, right? Like destabilizing our democracy, terrorism, but I also think that there's some really good things of the internet and that technology and the proximity that's important to highlight too. Like just the access to information we have now. Yes, we need to be able to vet it, but like when I reflect back on what I could access as a young kid in Texas with a set of encyclopedias that cost my parents thousands of dollars and a library card and the privilege to go around versus what somebody now can do with the internet and just having all of that knowledge, I think is incredible. And I also think the communities we've been able to build have been great, you know, like just the communities I found online of people who share my identity, share my interests, you know, like I think that's really powerful too. And there are lots of people who don't live, you know, in the coastal areas who maybe feel alone, and like the only way they can reach out to other people is online, especially if they're from marginalized or underrepresented groups. So I think that's also really powerful too.
Yeah. I mean, like one of the things I talk with my team a lot is that I think that power is access to information, access to money, access to decision-making rights and decision makers, and the reach of ideas, right? And like for the majority of like human history, those things were actually all tied up together, right? So like if you had the money, then you were able to get your ideas to a broader set of people.
Right.
If you had the money, then you were able to ensure that you had the decision-making rights, right? And one of the features of the current internet, actually, it's not that it has replaced that structure, because it still exists in media in a lot of really big ways.
Yeah.
But it has created a parallel structure where you can separate those things, right? So you don't need to have all of the money to be able to get your ideas fully penetrated, right? And you don't need to have like all of the information actually in order
for better or worse.
For better or worse, right? And like that has allowed things like Black Lives Matter to be like as big as it was and as national of a movement as it was, because it amplified all of these organizers that were already doing this incredible work on the ground and like a movement in a moment in time. And there was a time frame where if like that work was happening and folks were doing this kind of organizing on the ground, like it's same with like Occupy Wall Street, like what would happen is you had like four news stations and some guy, 99.9% of the time it was some guy, right? Like some white male with money decided how that story was going to be told, right? And we are now reaching a moment in which that story can be told through different storytellers, and it has forced a cultural reaction to that, and it both in like advantaging a cultural reaction and a cultural backlash to it, right? And so a lot, I think, when I see some of the decisions that are being made around political ads, with like Facebook, you know, and even with YouTube, I see folks trying to wind that back together, because you're like, if I can pay for a data targeted reach, then money is still like shaping who can hear my ideas, right?
And we are seeing that unfold.
Yeah, absolutely. And so like how we manage the creation of these parallel systems that are happening right now, I think are really going to determine what Internet 2.0 is going to be.
And can I add a layer to that, Karla? I love the way that you framed it. I think this is also happening, like just thinking about the diversity of perspective and the diversity of narrative is also happening at a time when our country is diversifying, right? When it's becoming more diverse than it has ever been before. So I think that makes the cultural and economic pushback even more salient, right? Because in a sense it is like we do see this like representation of people online that we didn't necessarily get prior, because of the fact that now the gatekeepers aren't as powerful as they were, and by the way that's being reflected in additional like representation just in society at large, and people are now really feeling like they now people think they have a right, and I'm not saying that in a sarcastic way, but like they feel entitled to that representation and to see themselves reflected, I think, in a way that we we didn't, because we didn't necessarily grow up with that.
Yeah.
And also they now have the numbers.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that just adds a different layer to it too.
Yeah.
This is interesting. So I feel like, my next question was going to be, what does responsible tech look like? But that also is predicated on an assumption that, we want tech to be responsible. I feel like the three of us definitely will probably coalesce around thinking that that's generally a good thing. But I feel like as I heard what you just said, Karla, what comes up for me is this thought about, this kind of, the internet 2.0, and thinking about that in the sense of what is reality and how should people be experiencing it. And I know that there's a thing I like to talk about a lot. I talk about how, everyone has their own reality. Everyone's realities are shaped very much by, their lived experiences, by the things that they've learned, by their values, by all of these things that we perceive and how we interpret what is happening around us. And then add like the internet, which not only is another facet of how we do that, but it's a world that also can, like, things that don't exist in real life can exist on the internet, and realities can exist that would be impossible in real life. And so it's very much, I think, a mind-bending kind of exercise. And so I guess where I'm going with that is, is that part of the problem, or is that just a thing that we have been constrained by in thinking about how we interact with like the real world, and that we need to start to really adapt to another like way of living and another way of communicating and another way of interacting with each other, that clearly we're like in this place of, I don't know if this is like the awkward teenage stage where we're kind of trying to figure it all out. Does it then open up a world that it kind of starts to make sense, and there kind of starts to be, new social structures and behaviors that are expected, and that then maybe the onus isn't so much on the platforms itself, but there's an expectation of how a person is supposed to carry themselves, in an internet like heavy society. I have no idea. These are just questions that I'm asking, but I know where I started was thinking like, oh, we got to like get this thing under control and put some guardrails on here. But now I'm also wondering, like, is there this other kind of universe where it really becomes about, kind of the sunscreen analogy, where, you understand that if you go out and you sit on the beach every day in the sun with no sunscreen on, you might get cancer, like, but you understand that, okay, you have to put sunscreen on, like, you have to like sit in the shade sometimes, like,
you're not doing coconut oil, you're doing SPF 70.
Exactly, right? Like, is it, which ones, and maybe it's a combination of the two. Like, I'm curious to know what you guys think.
Do you want to go to Marla?
I was going to ask you to take it first,
Okay.
Karla.
I'm good. So I think it's a combination of the two. Like, I'm a systems person, so I think that often, like, I think that Silicon Valley culture in particular has a very hard time understanding, like, systems thinking, because it has a very, like, individualistic, libertarian, like, I will not be told how I participate in a thing. I do it by my own free will.
Right. That's right.
And like, I think there are absolutely ways to triumph over systems that are not built for you. Like, I don't think you can be Latinx or a Black woman in this world. You know what I mean? Like, I think as a person of color, we are, as people of color, like, we are often like triumphing against systems that were not built for us, right?
Yeah, like every day I get up and my eyes open and I lay down and my eyes close, and then the next morning my eyes open again. I have triumphed.
I know, right?
That is another triumph. Living another day in this crazy shit.
And so, like, I am a believer that yes, we should do that. But like, if you think about, if you use the sunscreen analogy for that, right? Like, in the 80s, when I was a little kid, I remember, like, we just didn't have the information for that, right? Like, we didn't know what the right thing. It's not like everyone was cooking with coconut oil on the beach because they wanted their kids to get burned or to have cancer, right? Like, but I grew up in Southern California, right? Like, the beach was a free thing to do. So we would go and do that. Like, I remember one sunburn in particular that was really, really tough when I was a little kid. And like, it's not like my dad wanted me to get sunburned. He
Right.
just didn't know, like, every couple of hours you've got to put a certain amount of SPF on the child so that the child is not red at the end of the day, right? And like, it was not a common knowledge that was how, like, that both the benefits and the like the penalties for not treating your skin in the right way, right? And a public health campaign really helped create that knowledge for people. And we have now moved to a society that understands, like, that the sunspots are a little more dangerous than everyone thought before, right? And like, that if you're going to go out, like, there was not SPF 70 or 100 when we were kids, right? Like, that was not there, right? Like, there was like 35 maybe, right? And so, like, now we have moved as a society in that direction. Similarly with the internet, I don't think we know what a healthy internet and healthy internet habit looks like right now. I think you have some folks who are really good at being like, I don't participate in social media. I don't do, like, I actually take this off on the weekends. But like, when I am really struck by the language that I hear for people who have created the healthy habits is like, I am actually it's very much like rehab language, right? Like, I had an addiction and I am moving myself away from the addiction. And like, there isn't currently a language for that kind of health in a way that participates with those systems. And maybe there can't be, maybe they're so toxic that we should, but I don't think we know enough yet about how it works and what it does to our brains to do that.
That's true.
But I do know that the children's, like, when I'm talking to teenagers or even like the young people, they are not posting their lives in the way that the last generation did, right? So there's already there's already some learning that's happening, because they're like, why are, like, they have all this stuff around sharenting and kids getting upset with their parents sharing their pictures without their consent online and things like that. Like, that lets me know that some of the antibodies are being created in the next generation. But I also think that means that they're much more likely to create the systems and the public health thinking that are going to happen, rather than the people that were sitting on the beach getting burned and like then having to suffer with
Girl, I hope you are right. I hope you're right. I mean, as someone... I was gonna say, just as I have a kid, I know you think about this too, Y-Vonne, like, just thinking about, what is that? Yeah. Sorry, what were you gonna say?
Well, I was going to say, I think I have a different view. I mean, I think it aligns with where Karla ends up. But I think what's happening that is the little bit concerning is I kind of also almost see a cycle, right? Like, I think when I think of the internet, like 0.5, mid to late 90s internet, highly fragmented internet, really kind of bespoke community internet, and compare it to what's happening today. And it does kind of feel like the robber baron age, and there's this like consolidation of the space, like of power, of money, of bandwidth, and there are so many anti-competitive practices as people seek to exploit this new resource. And so I think to your sort of sunlight analogy, Aniyia, I kind of also think about, but there's climate change, or you know what I mean? Like, there's this force that's actually making the sun more dangerous, and has nothing to do with our own individual choices, and everything really to do with the way that the market's functioning. So on that level, I actually think there is room for regulation and having an updated, like, competitive, frame when we're thinking, like, from a legal perspective, and an anti-monopolistic frame, and understanding what happens when you essentially divide the internet, something as big as the internet, into 5 companies that now are, asked to curate our experiences based on their pursuit of profit.
Not even just our experiences too, but like our
view of the world, our preferences.
Like, they get to be the arbiters of truth, which I think is so dangerous. And in that way, that, like, kind of bring that back, and thank you for reining us back into the, like, okay, what does that look like for us to regulate these things? And just to, like, continue with our sunlight analogy is, like, maybe that, like, if we're thinking about the political ads for this current election cycle. It's like, you know, we're like the ants under the, you know, you have like the little magnifying glass with the sun coming through it, and you're like burning the shit out of that ant right now. Do you know what I mean? And no SPF is gonna like really help with that, right? So, so yeah, like, are there things that the two of you would say in terms of, you know, these should be really, I don't know, maybe nothing is easy, nothing is simple about this, but these would be really effective ways for us to kind of look at or frame how we legislate, regulate, put guardrails around whatever that is, technology to try to ensure less suffering and harm to other people. What do you think, Y-Vonne? Let's start with you.
I mean, I kind of like, I tend to go like really scholarly sometimes. So, but I was thinking about like the old like regulations for like broadcast media and how folks had to put guardrails around that very early on. Like, I don't know if like, you know, you remember like old shows, they would have commercials in the middle of the shows, and these commercials would like make wild claims that sometimes weren't good for people. And as people were testing the boundaries of TV, you had a lot of folks who were wielding influence that didn't necessarily have the public's health and well-being in mind, right? And I think that there's a parallel with that today. Although, and I would acknowledge that like the internet is very, very different than radio or television. But when I think about the sort of scale of the regulation we need, it feels like that's where it needs to sit. And I think that there are basic things that we know are really harmful, right? We know that misinformation is really harmful, whether that's around something like vaccines and public health and the current epidemic that we're now dealing with, or, you know, whether it's about our political system and upcoming elections. Like both of those things are really harmful. We also know hate speech is harmful, right? We know that harassing, like not just saying hateful things, but harassing people online, you know, having campaigns against people, that can result in real world violence. So I think that there are like some basic things that we can regulate on platforms, and we should not expect platforms to self-regulate. There's no profit interest in it. They're not going to do it.
Right.
You know, that we should think about like bringing, you know, reining in. I think the complicating factor, of course, is how do we do it? It's one thing to moderate content. I'm going to go back to the old world media example. When you have one television show, a writer's room, and some commercials, it's another thing when everybody's a writer and everybody's producing content, and all of that like has to be screened. Like, I mean, I do sympathize with the platforms in that way. So, I mean, I don't know if that's a great answer to your question, but that's kind of how I'm thinking about it.
I think it's a great answer. And I also, before I ask Karla to chime in too, it also does make me think about what other external factors could influence that as well. Like, I just think about the way in which misinformation and disinformation online really feeds into fear, right? And like there's a lot of people peddling lots of different flavor, like the Baskin Robbins of fear out there today. And how much of that could be a little bit sort of inoculated if there were more assurances that people had about, you know, what their lives look like. Like if people had better health care, people had clean water, people had some of these basic necessities, would these like fear-mongering kind of tactics be as effective? But yeah, what do you think, Karla?
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, I talked about like the two kind of parallel forms of information. And I think in like a healthy society, what would happen is you would have like the media ecosystem would help the social media ecosystem be true to itself and like, and be healthier, right? And instead it's like, you're taking all our money, so we're going to be less healthy. You know, like, it's like instead of being the moderating influence that it could be, it is actually like taking its cues from the way that it's been developed. Because
while smelling its own farts and thinking that it's still like beyond reproach.
Right? Like, we're so objective. You know, I know I say this all of the time, but it's like the lack of proportional representation in all our major industries and the lack of the equitable distribution of power, like, and major industries being government, the economy, media, finance, entertainment, really left democracy vulnerable as the demographics of the country shifted, right? And the thing that happens often, I think, because there are so few people of color in the companies, is that when you are selecting from a larger population, like the person of color that you are going to bring in, you get to select the viewpoint that that person has,
right?
And set up the power dynamics that allow that person to be there without either speaking their truth or having a different truth than the one that you have, right? And so the dangers that have been manifested because either A, folks had to undergo social risk in order to defend their communities, or they didn't even spot the risk because they've been in the soup for so long that they can't see it themselves, has meant that the companies are not spotting the problems before they become problems, because the only people that elevate are sniffing their own farts, right? And that to me, I agree with Y-Vonne. I don't think that you get out of that without regulation, but I do think that the law in its current setup is actually and the way laws are built right now is actually inadequate for what we need. Not that I have a ton of ideas for how to, but there is I believe that there are real concerns around freedom of speech in the world. Yes. But what we're talking about is not freedom of speech. When we're talking about the companies, we're talking about freedom to money-backed amplify, right? And so how do you regulate that without impacting this? I think is at once made more complicated and more simplistic than it can be all the time, right? And so I think that there's how do you identify the places where you create a disincentive for people to allow their platforms to run rough, right? And because there is enough of a penalty in the world that I am actually invested in creating the systems in a way that are manageable. Because right now, they aren't, and I do have empathy. I agree with you, Y-Vonne. I do have empathy for how complex the problems are, but the problems are this complex because the build of the thing was allowed to be something that is actually very far from being able to be controlled. And then when it does major harm, everyone's like, not my fault.
Exactly. Right.
And so but there is accountability, right? There is a need for accountability, and the fines that the companies are getting right now are so insignificant to their actual bottom line, because I don't think people understand the scope of the money that is being made right now, right? Charging Facebook $4 million when that's not something that that they can't recover in the next couple of hours is not going to deter them from doing anything, right? And which was I believe the punishment for the lying that they did that decimated several businesses within their video platforms, right? And there were actual lies that have happened and have repetitively happened. And to be fair to Facebook, not just from Facebook, right? And when they are caught in those lies, the punishment does not suit the crime.
Yeah, right.
And I'll add one thing to that, and I kind of want to return to your question about fear, Aniyia. In addition to the fact that the penalties that they face when they're actually breaking the law aren't sufficient to deter the actions that they're taking, I think there's legal loopholes in terms of liability. So for the most part, companies, they're not always liable for what's posted on their platforms, right? And I think I think like that this is like the liability question is, and the liability loopholes are actually are part of the issue as well, because as long as a company only has to take responsibility for the most extreme content, and gets to kind of choose and dodge responsibility, like there's going to be no counter incentive or no disincentive for them to monetize said content to get as much engagement as possible and make as much money as possible. Like it's just not going to happen.
And we started the conversation talking about how we came to Build Tech We Trust, and that was our deep fear that and knowledge that tech had platformed white supremacy in a way that allowed it to revive in a way that was causing major harm to real life death, real life threat to many different communities. And when you see that in some of these places, it is as if you are saying, it is the same dynamic when a woman complains about harassment. It's like, is it really that bad?
Yeah, right.
Like, how is that,
so strong.
It happens to everybody, right? Like, it's not just a specific thing. And it's like, no, actually, you have seeded the resurgence of a group of people gathering for the explicit extermination of other people. And you're doing, and it looks like white supremacy here, and it has looked like other things in other countries, because other countries have different problems. But that was,
I would say it looks like white supremacy in other countries as well.
Yeah,
actually,
yeah.
I would not give the international community that escape. Like, it totally looks like white supremacy. And there's actually a great graphic from the New York Times that I use sometimes in my presentations about, and my background is a little bit in counterterrorism, about how terrorists talk to one another online and use ideas from each other internationally to inspire new terrorist incidents. So if you look at the number of terrorists that talk about Norway in their manifestos, we know their manifestos because they post them online. Great. Like, you know what I mean? Like that reference Norway, we can sort of see this dialogue actually happening. Like it's not even something that we have to guess about. To Karla's point, like, terrorists are having conversations online and are inspiring each other to commit more terrorist acts, and that is being encouraged by platforms' monetization models.
Yeah.
So
and by the way, I would say, and by the way, right, like, there is a bit more of a lockdown on that whenever the terrorists are Muslim, and and really very little to none of a lockdown when it comes to white supremacy, which is about how American business actually is impacting the rest of the world.
But now that I feel like I also am coming to, it's like I knew this, but I didn't know just how deep it went. And the deeper I go, the more disappointed, and the more I'm like, well, yeah, okay, well, this makes sense. I become just about these roots of white supremacy, and specifically I think about, America's special brand of racism, right? And how that unfolds, and also why I love the Scene on Radio podcast, which I will stand forever. And that they're talking about democracy right now in a lot of ways where I think we have watched, we can now recount through the ages how these decisions and these laws were formed, that people had to abide by, and there was really no accountability for the people who were really kind of stacking the deck in their favor, or actively harming other people in the process of trying to get what they want, and just really generally being bad actors, with maybe some good branding around it. But I want to come back though. I feel like so accountability is a very strong theme of what we're talking about right now. Arguably, I would say that maybe this is something that goes hand in hand when we talk about, responsible tech, that accountability is maybe a core tenet or a core component that has to be present. That there has to be a consequence for these decisions and these actions or lack of action in some cases, that these companies are making, that you don't get to just hide behind innovation, which actually then brings me to another thing, because you did mention Facebook, and I also am thinking about how Build Tech We Trust had an opportunity to submit some questions for, the Zuckerberg hearing with the Financial Services Committee, which I think was in November of last year. And watching that unfold and just really, like, I think there's so much there, but I feel like one of the major things that I felt was like really disappointing and that really came up for me was that I was watching that, and not too long before that hearing happened, I watched The Great Hack on Netflix, which talked about Cambridge Analytica, right? And they showed this like scene of the guy who used to be the CEO of Cambridge Analytica, and he's like in some hearing in the UK, like, with their government people getting questioned. And it was just like, he was like so hell-bent on making his statement about how he was somehow the victim of the situation. And like
That's
at
wild.
the point that like, that they even kind of tried to like, first of all, they tried to discourage him from even giving his little, speech, and he insisted on doing it anyway, which I think is also a thing where it's just like, it's so mind-boggling to me because
I'm gonna rip apart the global economy and
know?
systems, and
then say
and
that
then
you
I'm gonna
did this
feel
to
bad.
me.
And then I'm gonna feel bad when you hold me accountable for it and be like, I am being attacked.
Right.
I'm the real victim here.
Exactly. Like, it's mind-blowing to me because I just feel like, I think that we have all grown up in a culture where we know that there's just no way on this planet that we would ever get away with being able to like make an argument. Like no one would ever even engage to even listen or pretend like they were gonna listen, which is wild to me. But anyway, so accountability I think is like a big thing. You also kind of started to touch on one thing that I do want to kind of also ask a question and bring into this conversation, which is about, the diversity kind of practices of these companies and them choosing, who is going to be working for their companies, who is representing their companies, whether it be, the media and who gets to sit in the anchor seat, or whether it's, who's in the, the rooms that get to make decisions about how the business is going to be run, who's on the board of the business and all of those things. So my question is, what's the opportunity for more robust, diversity, equity, inclusion practices at specifically, I'm thinking about tech companies, and I think because we've kind of like looped them into this conversation, media, because it has a role to play as well, and like that we, not specifically where it's like, let's like talk about like problems with hiring and all that stuff, but I mean like what's the opportunity in terms of how that could have a positive impact on the product with which they are tasked with selling?
Yeah.
I'll try to take a stab at it, and because I have a complicated view of this.
Yeah.
Like real talk.
Yeah, real talk.
The way that current structures are set up now is tech companies and media companies are meat grinders for people from underrepresented backgrounds, and even if you get those folks in the door, there's not a whole lot of psychological safety. There's not a chance that like they're going to be in the table, in powerful positions. And so I think that that it is important to recognize the dire need we have for proportional representation, which Karla has done such a great job of highlighting over and over. Mm-hmm. But I think it's also imperative for us to realize that the current structures that are set up right now are white supremacist structures. Yeah. Like the capitalist structures that we have are that they're extractive, and they're not really made to reflect the diversity of experience and encourage people to engage ethically when it comes to the world of business. So I think yes, we need representation, but we need to be really critical about what that representation looks like and what we want the end product of it to be, right? Yeah. Because I'm not here for a Black billionaire class. Yeah. That still does not benefit anyone, right? So if we're going to talk about representation, we also need to talk about not to sound like too Marxist or anything, but we need to talk about redistribution. We need to talk about how we think about the relationships between some of these organizations and society, and what it really means to work for the greater good, and whose interests are we really protecting and who's being centered as we think about who has access to power and all the other stuff. So I think, yes, I think representation has a potential benefit of making it so that we're more aware of the potential harms that we could create.
Right.
And, communities that are on the other end of this get heard and have a voice. But I think that benefit is limited so long as the power structures exist in the way that they do right now.
Yeah. I think if companies are starting with proportional representation instead of equitable distribution of power, then it's, we're kind of asking for the repetition, right? And like, if power is equitably, and like, I want to caveat, like, equitable distribution of power, and in the absence of what Y-Vonne's talking about, which is really taking a look at the way that shareholder profits is like the only thing that matters at the end of the day for whether or not someone is going to retain a CEO. Like, there were just a lot of news this week about activist shareholders at Twitter, and like people predicting that Jack Dorsey's not going to last 30 days and like all of this stuff, right? And let's be real, like, they're going to take Jack Dorsey out because that stock has not risen, not because he's allowed the plethora of bots that currently exist on Twitter and a like white supremacist force to metastasize there, right? Like, he's being taken out because he didn't maximize the bottom dollar, right? And that there are often incentives for those people. Like, I mean, there are plenty of folks that have ridden the coattails of all of this work, ridden the coattails of the diversity work into high net worth positions within companies as like the one person and done nothing to push back on those systems, right? And some of that has been like they don't have the power to do it, and some of that has been it is not in their best financial interest to do it, right? Yeah. And so like that absolutely needs to be there. And I think once we start having conversations about the equitable distribution of power across lines of difference in a company, you start to really like mess with some of the social capital that keeps all of those systems in place.
So how does one start to like attack that as an issue? Like, what's the first step? Because I know actually, like, I know that you have been really intentional about how you think about the distribution of power at the organization that you run. How did you even start mentally with figuring out what that looks like in practice?
I mean, like, I'm going to be very honest of like, it is a day-to-day struggle and understanding. And sometimes you don't understand that there's been an inequitable distribution of power until you are in the middle of it. And you're like, oh, shoot, that system that we were using meant that it prioritized, like, for instance, like lately I've really been thinking about all the decisions I can make as a CEO because I am in pain that my entry-level staff cannot make when they are in pain, right? And like how, and I go out and I talk to lots of people and I'm like trying to get advice, and everyone will counsel you. Like, actually, it's your pain that needs to get addressed, because if you can make the thing healthy, then it's going to be healthier for everyone. So you can like fool yourself very easily, because they're not in a social justice world, not in a like diversity and inclusion world, not in a business world will anyone tell you question when your pain is more important than their pain. And like that has been like, and like me really evaluating my own relationship to pain to understand what I have thought was normal, because I've been a high performing person in white supremacist systems and like really was actually abusive and I survived it. Or it was abusive and I gamed it, right? And like that is like some of the personal work I think each of us have to do to be in the middle of it. And then you create like the conflict that you need, right? Like I think a lot of white supremacist culture within companies is like, how do you squash the conflict? How do you move on and move forward? Like we can't always be in this, right? And I think my big learning arc over the course of the last few years as I became CEO for the organization has been like, actually, how is that conflict the best possible set of data for me that something is wrong with the distribution of power here?
Yeah.
Right? And like, where is that popping up the most? And where can I create systems that like alert me faster to that equitable? Because like, it's
really fascinating.
Like, it's one thing, like, if you're at a staff meeting and making an announcement and everyone's like, what the hell? Like, why did you, like, that's data and it's useful and it does make you reflect. But, like, I actually need to have that happen before I ever enter the announcement, right? And so, like, you know, we've done different things, like, you know, our team, I have a senior team, which is like people that I choose to be like my advisors on running the organization. And I've made clear that the job of that team is conflict. And the rest of the team gets to elect one senior team member. So I, as the CEO, pick like what my senior team is going to be, and then the rest of the organization elects a senior team member every 6 months. And that has been somewhat helpful, but I think that there got to be other kinds of things that we do as well. And it's just, honestly, like, it is the entire structure of business. The entire structure of business has to be rethought.
I agree.
And like, I think that a lot of what people hear when they're like, oh, those millennials, they keep disrupting everything and they're such entitled millennials, is actually like our power structures have ceased to work. The command and control model no longer works with a multi-generational, multiracial, multi-class workforce.
Right.
And they are creating conflict for you to understand that these systems are no longer working, right? The expectations you had of how this was supposed to work are no longer working. And instead of like, and that's not always going to come at you pretty, right? It's not going to be like, so I've noticed that these things are happening and I want you to, like, that often, like, the folks who are going to spot it first don't have the language to articulate what the thing is that they're very upset about, right? Like, you have to provide space for them to find it. They
might be most at risk by raising the issue.
They might be most at risk at raising the issue. They have worked in structures that when they do very good pattern spotting, immediately take them out, right? And so, like, you have to, like, we've also invested in, like, what does the emotional onboarding onto the organization look like so that everyone knows what they are entitled to here, right? And, like, and just, like, it's a lot of different, but it is, like, literally every single structure that you have, we have to rethink it for what is access to information, access to decision-making rights and decision makers, access to money, and access to the reach of ideas across the organization, and like literally in every place in the body of the org.
And I would just to jump on that, because I think Karla like laid it out beautifully.
Masterclass. Okay.
And I like definitely hear, particularly from the leadership level, what you're saying, and no need to even like repeat it. I think as a CEO, I'm also, thinking about distribution of power in my companies, and we advise our companies at the leadership level to do the same. That being said, I think that there is space for those folks who are not at the leadership level and also not maybe don't necessarily identify as being members of marginalized groups to push for this change as well. In fact, I think those people are really vital when we think about if we need to have this sort of corporate reckoning, that's a reckoning that happens in solidarity, it happens collectively, and it happens in community. And I heard you alluding to this a little bit, Karla, when you were talking about now, like, we are hearing more noise from the workforce. We are hearing more noise from younger generations and people from different backgrounds who are saying these structures don't work for us. And I think the next step is for us to really figure out how do we align collectively and demand the structures that do work for us. When we look at the history of the labor market, like what has gotten changed has usually been collective action.
Yeah.
Like collective action is incredibly effective. And what's currently blocking collective action now is, like, this goes back to your question, I think, a little bit about fear, Aniyia, is like the fact that a lot of us feel desperate. A lot of us feel afraid of losing our jobs. A lot of us don't recognize the power that we have in the market, particularly if we're from dominant or non-marginalized groups. And a lot of us are still seeing our interests as being pitted against the interest of other folks. But more and more, that's like changing. More and more as we're seeing, you know, wages haven't kept up with inflation. We don't have benefits. Like there's an epidemic and I feel pressured to go to work. You know, like more and more, I think our expectations are changing, and I think it is incumbent upon people to really figure out, okay, where do our collective interests align, and how can we act in a unified way to really create that balance of power? Because it's super hard, you know, to go up against the CEO of Google if you're one person. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, you know, but it is a little bit easier and still incredibly dangerous to do, as we've seen from Google, to do it collectively. And I think that in an ideal environment, that collective action, again, to take it back to regulation, but part of the reason why companies are escaping accountability now is that the regulatory mechanisms we put in place, like the National Labor Board and, you know, the EEOC, like none of those are really functioning. So and companies know that. So like in a well-functioning system, you also have that collective power, and you have trust that there are regulatory and accountability mechanisms outside of the corporate space that will back you up, right? And I think I think that it also.
Wow. So I feel like there's, if I'm trying to, because I'm like, we're running out of time, and I want to sort of like wrap up a few themes of what I feel like are really key in this conversation about, you know, our deep dive into the problems with technology, is that I'm hearing around, like, you know, people and behavior, right? Mostly the behaviors of people. And like also when we think about systems and designing systems, which is something that I say all the time, that we have to design with human behavior in mind, and really account for that. I'm also hearing accountability and trust. And those two things kind of like have a push and pull relationship, or at least they're very much affected by each other. Profit and resource distribution, just around the motivations for when and why and how these changes might happen, if ever. That our relationship to money and the resources that people have very much are tethered to the appetite and the desire and the will to make these kinds of changes. And also power and incentives, and how we think about both the dynamics that happen within these companies, but also the dynamics of the people, and how these are, you know, social media in particular, being used as you know, mechanisms to try to make changes to larger systems, and that this is actually something that has allowed people to build power, but there are these other forces that come into play where we kind of bring in again that profit, that money piece of it, and like it kind of just like starts to wash away some of the voices and some of that power by just really kind of poisoning the well. So, okay, I have one last question for you ladies, and then we'll tie it for the day, which is, what's one thing that people can start doing today to get us pointed in the right direction? Oof, I know. It's kind of a big question.
Can I take that one first?
Yeah.
And I know, well, I have a big answer, so I'm just gonna say my big answer.
Say it, girl.
I actually think that at the end of the day, we've talked a lot about structural issues. We've talked a lot about systemic stuff, and that can feel really big for like an individual person who's listening. But we've seen success stories just like when we think about what we can do individually with people who have no power. And I want to share one. It also involves Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, and it happened in Kenya. When Cambridge Analytica was first getting started, they experimented in a lot of countries. One of the countries they experimented in was in Kenya, in trying to influence the presidential election. I don't know if you remember that presidential election years ago, where there was like a lot of ethnic violence, a lot of sectarian violence. That was tied in part to misinformation online, propaganda that was used to sort of divide people more deeply and increase sectarianism, and so that happened in that election. That was also the first time people were really exposed to Facebook. It was where it was like widely available in Kenya. And so that happened in that first election. But then in the next election, they tried to do the same play. it didn't work. And why didn't it work was because the Kenyan users had gotten so much more savvy about social media so quickly, right? They had developed that mistrust early. They were critically looking at the information they got. They understood that power was not infallible. It was, in fact, corruptible, and people had an interest in correcting their viewpoint in the world. And so they exercised a lot more caution in the way that they engaged in the platform, and then that, in turn, diminished the platform's utility in influencing their decision-making. And so I think as we think about like what is the way forward for us, particularly when we're thinking about ethical tech or responsible tech and how do we reduce tech's power, that starts with us. You know what I mean? Like we are the ones that are consuming this and then using that consumption to influence our actions. And, you know, I think about it as a disease. Like there are ways that we can inoculate ourselves against that influence, and we just have to be really proactive and understand that technology has been designed to exploit our fears, right? To exploit threats that we perceive to our identity and our place in society. Like that is what Cambridge Analytica did, right? Like, and we have to be honest with ourselves that that is what the technology is doing to us, and intentionally put in place counter narratives to fight it. So I mean, so if I'm thinking about like what's one thing that a person can do, I think first a person can have an honest like self-reflection of who they are, and then think about the interests on the other side of the screen of the people that are marketing to them and trying to get their eyeballs. And they can be like really critical of the information that they received and operate from a place of skepticism. As opposed to seeing everything that they get as a universal truth. And I would finally say, not just rely on the internet as a resource for their information. Like, communities exist, and the internet is much more effective when we're isolated, when it's the only input we're getting, right? So it's also up to us to think about what does it look like to build community outside of the digital space, in the physical space, where we can expose ourselves to new people, new viewpoints, and counter narratives that aren't necessarily based on extracting our attention over a long period of time.
Cool. Yeah. So I'm gonna say that what I heard there was maybe like when you're seeing something, I'm gonna add to this too. Like you see something, it's got your like mind going, I don't know, you feel yourself getting emotional, excited, riled up, angry, whatever. You feel something happening. Maybe take a beat and start to ask yourself, what purpose does this thing that you're looking at serve, and where is it coming from, and who is this benefiting? And also expanding your perspectives by making sure you're talking to people out in the real world, getting more of an understanding of what's happening out there to be able to have that to contrast with what you're getting in the internet. Does that sound about right? Yeah. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'm about to publish something soon about Americanisms.
Yeah.
And I think that part of the thing around the internet accelerating our worst behaviors has been like the first time that we're really coming into contact with like the core, like starting to really grapple with core American identity-isms, right? Like we get what we work for, or and no one should be blocked from doing the thing that they have like worked to do, and the places in which I think, as Y-Vonne astutely pointed out, like it's like who benefits from this, and some of that actually is like real divide and conquer shit, right? And so. It's like that is like a core strategy of white supremacy is divide and conquer.
Making people fight with each other?
Absolutely, right? Like, and you know, it is Super Tuesday.
Oh my God, yeah, like to the thing we were talking about earlier. I'm like, absolutely. I gotta get the fuck off this internet shit.
Is like,
it's too much.
And like, there is a thing in American culture around being right, you know, that is like, our fucking undoing all the time. And like, I'm watching folks take, like, listen, like, I think the system is both much more corrupt than we can conceive and like much less intentionally corrupt than we could probably estimate, right? Like, and like the individual, there are corrupt individual actors certainly, but like, I think often, you know, like there is rightward kind of